Hey everyone, in today's video we're going to be going over props. Props are a fundamental thing to understand when using React, and you'll find them in almost every single React application. Now in this video I'm pretty much going to show you a very basic example of what a prop is and how props works, and then I'm going to show you a more complex example so you can sort of get an idea of how a best practice application would take advantage of props. Now if you look at the official documentation when it comes to things like props, you'll see that not everything is as simple as it could be, but essentially what a prop is essentially just a variable that a component can pass into one of its children components. So for example, as you can see here, they've sort of just made a little application that you can try on CodePen, and essentially what it will do is it has a welcome component, and within that welcome component it'll pretty much take whatever the person's name is and say hello comma their name. So as you can see here, we have hello Sarah, hello Kahal, and hello Edith. Those are some weird names, but but as you can see here, they have two. So in a lot of the times, a lot of people will not usually structure their components based on files when it comes to simple examples like this. So you can see here, this is a component in itself, and this app is a component in itself, and you know, all the stuff that they would find in their index.html, their index.js, sorry, is in here as well. So don't get too confused when you see examples like this and you know they have a function and then they're using that as a component type of thing. If you want to visualize it better, you can just imagine that these are in their own files type of thing. But essentially, they have this welcome component, and in there they have h1 tags, and they say hello, and then they have props.name. And you can see here, over here in the app, they have a div, and then they have three welcome components, and each one of them they're passing in this this variable called name, and they're setting it equal to something different. And whenever you pass in any variable, so let's say for example I were to go ahead and edit this, and I can say, you know, age equals 13. So you know, let's add an age for every single person, so age 13, you know, 14, 15 or whatever. I can also, you know, now that that is in there, whoops, I can go ahead and also say your age is, and then I use the squiggly brackets to denote that I'm going to be writing JavaScript, and I can do props.age. And if I were to go ahead and save that, it would say each person's age. Now, that is just an example to sort of help you wrap your head around how React does it. But let's go in their documentation. But let's go and make our own example and look at it from there. So I hope this font size is good enough. I know I got some feedback last video. And by the way, if you find value in this video, please consider liking, leaving a comment, subscribing. I read every comment. And one of my comments from the last video was you guys would like to see bigger font size. So I've sort of made the actual application screen a bit smaller. As you can see here, we still have our counter application from the last video, and I've upgraded the font size in this application. I think this is probably a good height. So what we can do here is let's go ahead and get rid of just the references to our counter code from last video, and as you can see here, we're just going to have a blank application. Now let's make the same application that they made. So we can have an h1 that says like company directory, for example. And in this application, let's make it so that each item, instead of, you know, being a welcome component that just says the person's name, it'll be like an employee component, and it'll give a little bit about the employee. So let's go ahead, let's create a new file, and let's call it employee.jsx. And now we're going to do our standard initialization of React component. First, we're going to import React from React, and then we're going to say const employee equals, and we're going to make an arrow function, and at the bottom we're going to export default employee. Now in here we can return, and in that return is where we're going to put our actual JSX, our actual HTML with embedded CSS or JavaScript. So we can do, you know, h1 and say this is an employee. Now notice we're not taking in anything yet. We're not displaying this anywhere yet, and because we're not taking anything in, if I were to use this component in our app.js over and over again, you'll see that it'll pretty much just print out this is an employee over and over again. So let's go ahead and try that. So let's import employee from and then the file ./employee. And let's come over here and say employee and make it with self-closing tags, and let's make maybe 4 of them. And you'll see here that because we're calling it 4 times, it's going to render 4 of these components. Now, let's actually use a prop. So let's say, for example, I wanted to get the employee's name, their full name. Well, the first thing I would do is I would pass in that as a variable into that component. So I can type name equals, let's say, for example, Jack. So let's make this person's name Jack. Let's make this like Stephanie. Let's make another one like George. And finally, let's make another one named, I don't know, like Anthony. And you'll see here when I save it, nothing actually happens because we're not actually using that variable. So the question now is, how do we use things that we pass in through here? Now, if we go into employee, we can see here that in this arrow function, this basic function, it takes in no parameters. However, I can't just take in, name like a regular parameter. What will happen with React components is everything that you pass in, just like this. So let's say, for example, even if I had another one, let's say I called these, and by the way, there's a cool little trick with VS Code. If you highlight one field and you want to change, let's say I want to change all these name fields to first name from name, I can highlight one of them, click Control D, and it will allow me to highlight multiple at once. So let's change this variable name to first name. And bam, just like that. Now I can create one called, last name, and make one equal to, Smith. Let's go ahead and add a last name for every single one of these things. So I can go ahead and do that same little VS Code trick and paste that here, so I don't have to manually copy and paste it. And let's, make Stephanie's last name like, I don't know, Stephanie like A, George B, and Anthony C, whatever. Now, even though I have, first name and last name in here, when I want to read these from, all of this will be structured into an object that gets passed in that is known as the props object. So if I were to go ahead and console.log, which is a good way to debug, by the way, if you're just a beginner in JavaScript, if I were to go ahead and console log that, you would see I can go into here into inspect element. I can go ahead and click console. Let's get rid of this. And you will see here that for every single object, we have a console log that ran 4 times because we have 4 of these components. And in every single one, you'll see that that object is present. And inside of this props object, we have 2 fields. We have a first name and a last name. You can see for the first employee object, the first name is Jack and the last name is Smith, just like we had here. If I were to open the second one, you would see Stephanie A. The third one, you would see George B. And the third one, you would see Anthony C. So this props object has every single item that we pass in through here nested inside of it. Which means if I wanted to use that, I would say, for example, employee name. And then I can do props. So I type in my squiggly brackets to denote that I'm going to reference a JavaScript object. So let's go ahead and just add a div around here to make this more clear that we're writing HTML code. So you can see here we have employee name and nothing will render. So we open our initial brackets, and we can even, let's just make this smaller text so it doesn't take up that much room, since we don't have it taking up too much space. So there we go, employee name, and we can do props dot whatever we want. So for example, first name, and there you go. Now each one of these components will display the name that comes from over here in our parent component. And this is known as a parent component because it is directly calling our employee component, which is known as our child component. And just for an official definition, a prop is essentially a variable you pass from a parent component to a child component. In this case, we're passing the first name and their last name in. And you can see here, employee name is props.first name. Now we can also, add another one. We can add, maybe a space in between here and add the last name as well. So we can add another bracket and do props dot last name, just like that. And you'll see here, there we go. Whoops, I don't need that. We can see here, there we go. Jack Smith, Stephanie A, George B, Anthony C. Now, let's talk about best practices when it comes to using props. So, the first thing that is worth noting is I could, for example, replace this whole string with a string interpolation. And if you're not familiar with string interpolation, pretty much all string interpolation is a way to sort of inject strings into JavaScript. So I can wrap everything around in these squiggly brackets to denote that I'm doing JavaScript. Then instead of using regular quotes like, you know, this or this, I use backticks. And finally, with backticks, so everything that is within the backtick will be seen as string. So if I were to save this, you would see it would literally display all of this as a string. Now, when you want to inject variable names into this format, you just wrap whatever the variable name is around in squiggly braces with a percentage sign. So for example, if instead of displaying the literal string props.firstname, we want to actually display the variable that is within props.firstname, we wrap it around with squiggly braces and we put a dollar sign around it, and that will make it so for props.firstname it gets the actual variable name as well. And we can do the same thing here. So that is one different way of displaying. We can go back to the other format just so it's a bit easier to understand, and that was just more for your understanding to know that that actually exists. Now if we come back to props, what we can do is something known as object destructuring, and object destructuring is a very core part of React code, and something that you will see if you look at other people's React applications time and time again. And what that essentially means is, let's say for example, I wanted to actually just, instead of for every single, you know, variable that I pass in here, first name and last name, having to call it by props.firstname and props.lastname, I can actually take that variable and make it into its own variable in this file. And the way that works is you type const and then the two variable names, so first name comma last name, is going to be equal to props. And when you're first learning React, this can seem very, very confusing. And instead of having to do props.firstname here, I can just go ahead and do first name, and instead of having to do last name, I can go ahead and do last name. Now, this can be a bit confusing. When I first learned React, I thought that this whole structure was a bit confusing. I didn't really understand what was going on. But essentially, if we go ahead and console.log props again, if you remember, props is essentially just an object that has values inside of it. Destructuring is the act of taking each object from each field from that object and making it its own variable. So when I type first name here and I put it in these squiggly braces and I make it equal to object props, what I'm saying is I am taking all of these fields out of this object and making it its own variable. Now this is something that you will see time and time again in React code, so it's a very good idea to understand how destructuring in JavaScript works. Essentially, that is basically it. I can, for example, name I want to pull first name and last name out of this, you know, out of the variable, this props object that we are getting from our component, and I want to create their own variables, and I want to use them just like this, so I don't have to keep doing props.firstname for everything. So that is what destructuring is, and it's super important that you understand how it works. And I encourage you guys, as sort of an assignment of this video, to try and make your own React component with an employee component, just like we did here, your own React application with the components we've built, and try adding more props and practice destructuring them. So for example, if I were to add, you know, age equals 13 here, age equals 13, let's just say, or we can make it, you know, maybe instead of 13, let's make it like, I don't know, 21 or something. Let's say everyone's the same age and they're all 21 years old. Now what I could do here is I could also extract the age variable from props, because now we are passing it in, and you know, I can do something like who is age you know, age, just like that. So Jack Smith, who is age 21, Stephanie A, you know, who is age 21 as well. You know, and everything we pass in, we can destructure it, we can extract it from that props object. Now, let's get into more complex, and you don't have to, so this basically you should definitely know, and the next examples I'm going to show you are more complex cases where, you know, you don't have to worry about until you're too familiar, but I still want you to understand them because it'll help you going forward, as you know, use React over and over again, to understand how this works, because you're definitely going to see this around. Let's say I wanted to not call this age in this component, but I wanted to apply it to a different variable. Let's say our component is passing it in as age, but I wanted to call it something different in my component when I actually, you know, use that variable. What I could do instead is, where age is, I can do a colon, and I can do, you know, whatever I want the new variable name to be. So like employee age. And if I were to save it like that. So now if I try to run the file, you'll see I get an error saying age is not defined over here because we reassigned that variable to a different name. So if I were to replace this with employee name, you would employee age, you would see it uses it in a completely different context, with a completely different variable name. So that is sort of the gist of destructuring. There's a lot more complex things you can do with destructuring as well, but I plan on making another video straight up showing all the different use cases of destructuring at a later date. But for now, it's good that you understand the fundamentals of what destructuring is. So now, another cool little thing about destructuring that not a lot of people know is you can actually straight up destructure when it comes to React props straight in your arguments field. So you can see here, you know, I take in props as an argument for my function, as a parameter, and then I am simply, you know, doing the destructuring on that props argument. But if I wanted to, I could instead actually just do this destructuring, and you'll see this sometimes in a lot of people code. So I'm showing you this, so you know, if you guys go on Stack Overflow and you see someone's code, you're like, what the heck, this guy didn't pass in props, he just passed in a bunch of variable names. But what is actually happening is you can do destructuring straight inside of the actual parameter itself. So I am pretty much saying, I know that my you know, employee thing is only going to get one variable, and that variable is going to become props. And I am destructuring all of these fields outside of that props variable, essentially, is what this is saying. So you'll notice it functions the exact same way. It's just sort of a shorthand function, so you don't have to, you know, go ahead and declare props and then under here do it. I still like doing this in most of my applications because I find it a lot easier to read the code, and a lot of the times you're going to find that, you know, props might be passing in not just, you know, basic variables like this, but they may pass in objects itself, so you have nested objects, and I find it a lot easier, and your code is a lot easier to read when you sort of destructure all those nested props, which, like I said, we'll talk about in a further video. But for now, let's keep it looking like this. We are pretty much just destructuring our each variable and each field name from our props, and we are displaying them, you know, just basically how you would display it in regular HTML. Now, let's go ahead and look at the best practice for actually calling the employee function 4 times. And this is something that you won't find too often in the documentation, and a lot of beginners in React, I notice, once they sort of learn this, you know, create a new employee thing, you know, copy and pasting it 4 times and changing the information. But you have to understand, I'm sure you're probably asking yourself, well, when we have an actual application, how are we just going to, you know, let's say I have 100 employees. Am I going to copy and paste this component 100 different times? And the answer is no. And I'm going to show you what you would do instead. Sorry about that. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to store your employee data somewhere else. So a lot of the times you're going to be getting this employee data back in, you know, an object that comes from, let's say, for example, a backend, you know, a database of some sort. Now, we're not at the point, and we will get to the point where we're gonna do a huge project, and I'm gonna show you how to integrate backends. I'm gonna show you how to you know, deploy it and stuff like that, but we're not at that point yet. So we are going to just create a constant with all the employees information. So let's call it, you know, employee info, and we're going to make that an object, or sorry, an array. because we have multiple different employees, and each employee is going to have its own object that is going to have all of these fields inside of it. So it is going to be an array of objects in this case. So our first name for our first person, we can say, is Jack, and then, last name, Smith, and then age, 21. So we can go ahead and, do this for every single one of our employees. So, I think the next one is Stephanie B. Oops. Stephanie B. Then the next one is, George C. All the ages are the same, so we're not changing that. And then Anthony. Oh, it was Stephanie A. It doesn't really matter. You don't need to keep it the same, but just to make it understandable. And we can even, because this is a constant, we can even move this outside of our component itself and just make this a constant over here. Now what we can do is we can do something called a map. And mapping is sort of like a for each loop. If you're familiar with for each loop, except the difference is it will return something. And when you create a map in JSX, it will return each component that you nest inside of it. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. So let's first of all comment out all this employee code that's displaying each employee individually. Now let's make our squiggly braces to denote that we are working in JavaScript. And let's move this down a bit so it doesn't, it's not too confusing. So we are going to create our squiggly brackets to denote that we're going to write JavaScript, and we are going to write employee info dot map, oops, lowercase. And map is just like, if we look at the official documentation, JavaScript map, it's basically a function that runs on any iterable, and what you can do is just edit an array or loop through each item in an array and return something. And essentially what we want to do is we have an array called employee info, and we want to loop through each employee object and return this employee component with the proper information passed in. So when we do map, we're going to get an argument, so our first parameter, which is just the employee itself. And then over here we can we have just a function, employee, and this employee variable is pretty much just going to be equal to this object every time it loops through. So essentially what we're just doing is we're taking a giant array of objects and we're looping through it, and each loop, this employee variable represents the object with all the information into it. So we can go ahead and destructure, first name, last name, and age from this employee object. And then we can, just like a regular component in here, we can return just the employee component. And in here we can say first name equals to, and because we're going to, instead of just writing plain text, we're going to reference a JavaScript variable. We are going to put squiggly braces and use this first name variable. Then last name is going to be equal to this last name variable, and then age is going to be equal to age. Now we can go ahead and do that. We can go ahead and self-close these tags over here, and we can go ahead and save that, and you will see that it will still go ahead, and now even though we are only calling the employee thing once, it will still display 4 different employees, because this is essentially a for each loop that is returning an employee with all the information dynamically being passed in. Now, this is probably what is going to be hard for you to wrap your head around, and this is something that you should definitely do this for yourself and practice doing this, because this can get a bit difficult. Now, the last twist I sort of wanted to throw in, and you'll notice this is better because we're not, even if we had 100 different employees here, well, this loop would just run 100 times, and each time it would have a different employee with the proper information added in. Now, the last thing I want to give you an introduction to, but if you don't understand this fully, it's okay. You don't really need to fully move forward and understand things, is something known as spread. So when you look at if you were typing JavaScript spread, there is something known as a spread operator, and this spread operator is essentially an ellipses, 3 dots. And when you use it, you have to use it on an iterator. And what that will do is it will essentially just return every single field within that iterator. So for example, they use a sort of weird example. So they have a sum function which takes in 3 variables, and the 3 variables are x, y, and z, and then it will add x, y, and z together. And you can see here they make an array of numbers. So essentially what they want to do is they want to pass all 3 of these numbers into the sum operator to do sum x plus y plus z. Now one way you could do it is writing sum, and then for each parameter doing numbers 0, numbers 1, and numbers 2 to get every single element to the 0th, the 1st, and the 2nd number of each element and pass it in. But instead what they are doing is they are spreading, doing what is known as a spread operator on that array. And what that will do is it will expand all the elements in the array as an object, and it will pass it in like that instead. So I'm not if you can guess where we are going with this is, instead of where is our... So over here, instead of destructuring each variable and then manually passing each variable in one by one, what we can do is, because our variable names are named the same way that we are going to use it in our props in our employee component, we can actually just use the spread operator on the employee object to pass all of this in instead. So for example, we can go ahead and delete this. We can delete all of this. And in here, instead of having all that code, I can just write ... employee and save it. And you'll see it still works the exact same. Now, this might look like magic, and I've sort of intended it to be like that, because what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to sort of show you how many different ways there are to do React and how clean you can actually get your code to be. When I started the series, I mentioned that I really wanted this series to be about showing you the basics of React, but then also showing you the best practices when it comes to React. You have to understand the best practices when it comes to React are not going to be things that are extremely easy to understand, because there are things that simplify code heavily. If you think about it, we just went from all this code, and imagine if we had way more employee parameters. Imagine we have if we had 20 different parameters ranging from an employee's height, an employee's eye color, an employee's role, an employee's colleagues, an employee's all that stuff. We don't want to. It's not good practice to destructure all of this and then pass it in. Our code is going to become huge and gigantic, and that's where this whole idea of the spread operator comes in. But as a beginner, you don't have to follow that, especially if you're trying to just learn. Following these sort of best practices might confuse you even more, and the only reason I'm showing this to you is so that you are aware of it. And as you get better, you can start sort of cherry picking these best practices tools like the spread operator and implementing it into your code as you become better as a React developer. But if you don't fully understand what is going on here, don't worry about it too much. I will cover it in future videos more in depth, and once you are more familiar with React and once you've done more React, it will become easier for you to understand. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is, you'll notice I'm getting this little error over here that says I need a key prop in a list. Essentially what that means is, every single time you ever do a map operator, or you're doing some sort of loop operator, and you're returning you are returning a element in React, and you're returning multiple of them, React needs to have, or whether it doesn't need to, but it is good practice to give each one of these an individual key variable so React can differentiate them. So for example, if I were to inspect element and come in here, let's go ahead and raise this, you'll see that I have here are where each of my employee objects are. So bam, 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 and bam. you can see each one of these is the same. All that React is saying is it wants a key parameter passed in, and it should be something that completely differentiates them. So for example, in this case, a unique identifier of an employee might be their employee ID. Employee ID, for example. So let's say I make, Jack employee ID number 1. Make Steph employee ID number 2. George employee number 3, and Anthony employee number 4. And now what I can do here is I can type key equals the employee ID, and to do that we can just reference it by doing employee.employee.id. and you'll see here, if I were to save it, all of a sudden that little console error that we were getting will go away. It's worth noting for this whole ID thing, if I were to have 2 employees with the same ID, you'll get an error saying, oh, there's 2 list objects with the same key. So just make sure whatever you choose to be the actual key is completely unique, or else React will yell at you. It doesn't really affect performance or anything like that. It's just sort of a best practice thing from React itself. So there you have it. We learned a lot today. You might have to watch this video a couple of times to fully wrap your head around what we're doing. As homework, I would recommend trying to build the exact same application we just built and try playing around with it a bit. Try implementing the spread operator yourself. Try adding another, variable and see what else you can do with that as well. Practice maybe adding another field and stuff like that. This is sort of a really pivotal video, because if you can wrap your head around the ideas that we just talked about in this video, then the rest of React is going to come a lot easier. And it's sort of a lot of an easier journey from this point onward. So this was a very, very, very important video. So make sure you understand the concepts that we talked about here fundamentally. Don't worry too much about the really advanced stuff like destructuring in the parameters and the spread operator and stuff like that. But yeah, make sure you understand the fundamentals of the idea of how we did the mapping, having all your data sort of in an object, and the idea that this map can return multiple employee components that then gets rendered onto the page. If you found value in this video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment. I read every single comment, and if there are some comments that are saying all this stuff was a bit too complex and this one might have been harder to understand, maybe in the next video I'll go over some of the details again in a more easy to understand manner. But thank you all for watching. I hope you guys stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.